All right, I think we're going to get started here. So welcome everyone. We are here to talk about the most vital federal support for food security, and that is SNAP. And the SNAP program provides a subsidy to students that helps them afford nutritious food. The problem is that SNAP is a bit of an obstacle course for students to receive. So we are going to talk here about what can be done at the state level and the federal level to make it easier for students to receive SNAP and to benefit from it. So I'm going to start with a very short PowerPoint to get us going, and then I'm going to turn it over to our remarkable speakers here. So let's talk about SNAP. So the main issue with SNAP is that while nationally more than 80% of eligible adults get SNAP, only about 18% of college students do. And so the ways to make change are, first, that the states can do a better job of outreach to students. Second, the states can use federal flexibility in the interpretation of their regulations to make more students eligible for SNAP, and importantly, to make them eligible for SNAP without having to work 20 hours a week. And then finally, Congress can expand student eligibility, which would by far be the simplest and most straightforward way of doing it. But we never like to do things the simple and straightforward way, now do we? And an example of this is Virginia, which along with California is the only state that actually tracks students who receive SNAP and looks at them as a share of all students who are eligible for SNAP. And as you see, we're talking about a total of maybe 12% of students who receive SNAP at all in Virginia. And this is unfortunately typical of virtually all states. And then we should look at who is actually students. If you are studying less than half-time, congratulations, you are not a student. You would just use normal rules. But if you are half-time, then you qualify for, an exemption if one applies to you. And all you need is one exemption. TANF, participate in a state and federally funded work-study program, employment and training, or the one that we might prefer least, work 20 hours a week in paid employment, which of course competes with your actual academic responsibilities. Be young enough or old enough to qualify. If you're unable to work for health reasons, or if you're responsible for a dependent child under the age of 6, or 12 if you have difficulty finding childcare, on-the-job training program, and of course the dependent child. And then an important thing to consider is that with COVID-19, Congress created special exemptions that provide much broader access to students. Normally, you have to be participating in federally financed work study. And of course, that is not easy to obtain. Many colleges are simply not allocated money for federal work study. And so this exemption allows you to receive SNAP if you are simply eligible for it, or if you are in a household that is sufficiently low income that you have zero expected family contribution, which if I recall correctly is about 40% of students in who receive the Pell Grants, then you also qualify for it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that students know about this. And we found in our research that students are actually not receiving the information that they need to know that they could be eligible and they should apply. These exemptions only last for the extent of the public health emergency declared by the Department of Health and Human Services. And we don't know when that will end, but at the point that it ends, then there could be many students who lose their eligibility for SNAP. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. We have with us Pat Baker, who is an analyst, and I think I would say a leading authority at the Massachusetts Law Reform Institute. We have Ashley Burnside from CLASP, who works at the national level and has a great deal of experience and knowledge in this field. And Chris Baker, who is a legislative strategist for Partners for Hunger-Free Oregon, who's been doing yeoman work in Oregon. I'm not sure if anybody actually uses the word yeoman anymore, so I apologize for that. And is come to share the benefit of her experience and wisdom with us. So who would like to get started?
I'm happy to start us off here.
Okay.
Let me share my screen really quick. Okay, are you all seeing the slides? Perfect. So thank you all so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to join this conversation. Like Tom said, my name's Ashley and I'm a policy analyst at CLASP, and I'm going to spend about 10 minutes talking about SNAP access through the lens of federal legislation. Like Tom said, one way that we can ease access to SNAP for college students is through passing legislation through Congress. But as we all know, Congress can be slow to get things done, and there can be a lot of barriers in that step. I'm also going to talk a bit about some of the misconceptions that lawmakers may have about college students and how we can frame our advocacy around that, and also talk a bit about the public health emergency ending, just like Tom was talking about at the very end here. Before I dive in, I just wanted to quickly describe who CLASP is. The Center for Law and Social Policy is a national, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization advancing policy solutions for people with low incomes. We have different cross-cutting policy teams that work on how to improve public benefit programs to reach different communities. And we have multiple reports on our website specifically thinking about how to increase access to SNAP for college students. And I'm happy to share some of the reports as follow-up resources to this workshop. But I encourage you all to check out our website and see more of the work that we do. To kick us off here, I just really wanted to name that there's this huge misconception about who college students are, and that is what is partially shaping the policy of how students can access SNAP, and also framing how lawmakers view college students. And I'm sure we're all aware of this disconnect, that the traditional college student is seen as an 18-year-old coming right out of high school who's getting financially supported from their parents, probably from a middle-class family. But in reality, over half of community college students and a rising number of four-year college students are considered non-traditional, quote unquote. They may be student parents themselves who have to support their own children in addition to supporting themselves. They may be later on in their careers and returning to school to get a different certification, or after serving in the military. They may be first generation, they may be homeless or housing insecure or aging out of foster care. And all of these different circumstances, of course, make it much harder for a student to financially support themselves and make it more likely that they will need to rely on different supports to help them make ends meet. But unfortunately, when Congress shaped our federal policies around access to benefits, they weren't thinking of the reality of who college students are. They were thinking of their perception of who they believe a college student is. And that is part of what makes these policies so needlessly complicated. And I encourage you all, as you think about doing any type of advocacy to your lawmakers or to your state officials, really name who the college students are on your campus. What are the barriers that they are facing to completing their degrees, and what are the hurdles that they face in accessing basic needs? And this slide here just names some of the other burdens that are in place for college students. I'll name that there is a lot of stigma in enrolling in public benefits, and there is a lack of awareness among college students that they may be eligible for benefits and know to apply. These are all things that we need to think about when kind of naming this issue. And this leads me to the problem, which Tom was just describing earlier, that there are a lot of college students out there who are eligible for SNAP and who are facing food insecurity, but not accessing it. The pie chart on this slide comes from a GAO study that was conducted in 2018. So important to note that this was before the COVID-19 pandemic, where we of course know that even more students face financial hardship. But this report found that 57% of potentially eligible students who have low incomes and at least one additional risk factor for facing food insecurity were not enrolled in SNAP benefits. And this is a problem because this shows that there is this gap of students who could benefit from accessing SNAP, but who aren't receiving it, whether it be due to the burdens in place in applying, the stigma, the lack of awareness, or just the complicated nature of what it takes to apply. And we, of course, know that it benefits students to access these benefits. It helps them improve in classes, improves their health outcomes. So it's really important that we think about ways we can, at the state level, increase access to SNAP, and at the federal level do so. And thankfully, there are some upcoming federal bills that can increase access to SNAP for college students and help to hopefully reduce this gap. And I'm going to talk about a few of them now. The first being the Farm Bill, which I'm sure many of you on this call are familiar with. The Farm Bill is a comprehensive piece of legislation that really sets the policy for a majority of our agriculture and nutrition programs in our country, including the SNAP food benefits program. This bill is typically reauthorized every 5 years and was last passed in 2018, meaning that next year there is going to be another version of the Farm Bill passing through Congress. And the Farm Bill is an opportunity to really move a lot of different reforms to the SNAP program, one of which could be increasing access for college students. And I'll note that between 2018 and now, members of Congress are much more aware of college student access to SNAP being an issue. So I do think there is a big window here for really advocating for this being included in the bill that maybe wasn't as present 5 years ago. As CLASP has been talking to members of Congress, they've really been saying that they're still very early in the negotiation process right now for the Farm Bill. They're likely not going to turn to this bill until after the midterm elections. So come December and after, we really do have a window to reach out and urge members to understand the urgency of changing these policies. And I also will flag that the Agriculture Committee is the members who really do have a lot of leeway in leading the negotiations for the Farm Bill. So I encourage you all to look at what members are on the Ag Committee and think about who you can be advocating for in that committee, who may have a lot of sway in what happens to the Farm Bill over the next year. And I'll also note there are a lot of opportunities to improve bold changes in SNAP in the Farm Bill, not just increasing access to students, but we can really advocate for some bold changes to this bill. And CLASP is actually releasing a report at the end of this month that's our vision for what an anti-racist vision for SNAP would be and how we can achieve that through the Farm Bill. I encourage you all to read that report when it's posted, but in that report, we're going to really talk about what should we be advocating for to make this program equitable and as accessible as possible to recipients, not just thinking about what's politically feasible. So on this slide, I've included some of the many of things that we could be advocating for in this bill beyond just expanding access to students that would make SNAP a more effective program in helping people be food secure. And there are a couple other bills that have been introduced in Congress in recent years that are more standalone bills that would also increase access to SNAP for college students. The first is the Enhanced Access to SNAP Act, or the EATS Act. This was introduced by Representative Gomez and Senator Gillibrand. This bill would add attending an institution of higher education as an exemption from the SNAP student requirements. So if a student was applying to the program, they would be able to not have to meet the work requirement simply because they're attending college, which of course would ease access for students. The second bill is the Student Food Security Act of 2021. This was introduced by Senators Warren, Murphy, Padilla, and Sanders. This bill would make those temporary provisions that Tom was talking about earlier that Congress passed during the COVID pandemic permanent, so that more students could easily access SNAP than currently are able to do so. I'll flag that both of these bills currently only have Democratic co-sponsors, and in Congress, if you have bipartisan support, that does make it a lot more likely that things will push through. So I do encourage you all to think about, are your lawmakers in your state currently co-sponsors to these bills? And if not, try to encourage them to understand the urgency of making these changes to help more students be eligible. One framing that could be useful is lawmakers on both sides of the aisle do see an importance in increasing college completion rates for students. And we do know that if students have access to food and other basic needs, that will make it likelier that they will complete their college career. So that could be one way that you try to frame this issue to try to reach lawmakers on both sides to see the importance of this. And the last thing I'll talk about before turning it over is how the end of the public health emergency could be a window for also creating opportunities for students to access SNAP. As Tom was saying, Congress passed 2 temporary policies to make more students eligible for SNAP during the public health emergency. And like Tom said, once the public health emergency ends, those policies will expire. Specifically, 30 days after the public health emergency ends, when that student reaches their next recertification, that is when they would be kicked off of those existing exemptions. But there is an opportunity for states to help identify students who still could be eligible for a different exemption, but maybe had barriers to proving those exemptions before, and ensuring that those students can remain having access to SNAP even after the public health emergency expires. It's an opportunity to connect with financial aid offices, colleges, and state agencies to really come up with a plan for how we can support these students once this expires. And while we don't know for certain when the public health emergency is ending, signs are pointing it to it probably being early next year. So we probably do have a few months here to think about this, but come the beginning of next semester, there may be the very real risk that students are going to be kicked off of these benefits if we don't have a plan in place to help keep them on. And I will flag that this may be an advocacy opportunity if we do see the risk of students getting kicked off of benefits who are still facing food insecurity. This could help you raise awareness to lawmakers of why it's so important to make these policies permanent, because these students are at risk of being kicked off through no fault of their own, despite the fact that they're still facing hunger, just because the public health emergency is ending. So I encourage you all to also keep this date in mind as you think about opportunities for reaching out to students and as you're thinking about advocacy strategies for supporting college students. And on this slide, I've included my email address, so you can feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions. But with that, I will turn it over to Pat or Chris to kind of dive into the state context.
So Pat will go next, and I just want to preface this by saying that Pat and Chris are not actually related. So in case you were jumping to that conclusion, now you know that. Pat, go ahead and take it away.
We are sisters in the struggle, so we are related, all related. So yeah, I'm Pat Baker. Mass Law Reform Institute is a statewide poverty law center, much like the Western Center on Law and Poverty, Empire Justice, Maine Equal Justice. We work with all the local legal services organizations in the state, but MLRI focuses specifically on systemic issues on poverty. We do class action litigation, state and federal legislation, administrative policy advocacy, and trainings. And so we have a long history of working on poverty issues. I focus on the food security side of the coin. And we've also done a lot in Massachusetts on college student eligibility in the state. So I will be sharing my slides, but I just want to also say it's an honor to be here with Tom, Chris, and Ashley. Ashley and I have done a bunch of work together on some of the student policy issues, and I'll be sharing in my slide a link to a report we did in 2021. Okay, this is where you all get to see how adept I am at screen sharing. Oops, why isn't this working? There we go. So just by way of background, you know, before COVID, we had huge food insecurity among college students. And as Ashley noted, Congress has made it very complicated to qualify for SNAP. Certainly the perception of who is who is a student to begin with is very much skewed towards a very traditional 18 to 22-year-old, middle class, et cetera. The SNAP food restrictions actually came into place in the 1960s and 70s when Congress believed that college students were A, voluntarily idle, they had withdrawn themselves from the workforce, and B, that households and families could support themselves without advanced education, without a college degree. I believe it was also a reaction at the time to student involvement in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, which I think fueled a very negative perception of the student population. And so if you look back at the legislative history, access to SNAP benefits in particular has really been informed by the view that Congress had at the time of students being voluntarily idle. And perhaps at the time, working class households could maybe make an sufficient income to barely survive without a college degree. That is no longer true, and the optics of this are going to inform the success of our federal legislative campaigns. So I think everything Ashley said about who the students are, what's needed to support yourself are really critical in your advocacy. Since COVID, we have, of course, seen, as every state has seen, not only an uptick in food insecurity, but also the cost of food itself. One of the questions I wanted to address is why don't more students participate in the SNAP program? As you've seen earlier in the slides, there's a low under participation in general, and certainly the public health emergency exemptions have done a lot to change that. But in Massachusetts, the core reasons we see for under participation are the rules are too confusing. There's this laundry list of exemptions that people can't keep track of. Second, a lot of the framing of eligibility often starts with, you got to work 20 hours a week, or maybe you meet one of these other exemptions. And it's confusing, but starting out with talking about a work for food rule, I think makes it hard to explain that there's many exemptions to it. Verifications, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. We see chronic problems with people finding the pieces of paper the state needs in order to certify eligibility as a significant barrier. Financial aid under federal law, all federal financial aid and federal work study is non-countable, but a lot of states still embrace policies to count state, private, or local financial aid. And then that requires a student to have to come up with all sorts of proofs to show what is or is not available for basic living expenses. And then inability to use SNAP on campus, either because it can't use it for hot meals or there's no grocery store that accepts EBT on campus. So those are, I think, some of the leading factors. And then on the other side of the coin, really lack of communication from trusted sources. For example, financial aid offices, which are telling people what their student awards are, aren't explaining that another form of financial aid could be the SNAP program. I know a lot of colleges have basic needs staff, single stops, et cetera, that work on campus, but they may feel, because of the top list of complexities I just mentioned to you, that they don't feel equipped to explain, here's how you apply for SNAP and here's the exceptions. Healthcare providers, again, they could be a huge source. Massachusetts just recently put a simple single SNAP checkbox on the Medicaid application that says, yes, I want this application to qualify for SNAP. Doesn't require the healthcare provider to understand all the rules, and it creates a legally filed application that the SNAP agency has to follow through on. But again, and healthcare providers are trusted sources, but the more complicated the program is, the less it's talked about. So I wanted to touch on a couple of areas where states have some flexibilities, options to really try and make their SNAP program more accessible. These are recommendations that we have, assuming that we see the sunsetting of the public health emergency provisions in 2023. The provisions that Ashley described earlier and Tom described of students who, because they have an expected family contribution of 0, get a Pell Grant or were awarded work study, can qualify for. The first, a number of states have done this, which is to allow students who have been awarded work study but don't have a work study job to qualify as exempt from SNAP, because the federal rules say that if the student is, quote, participating in the SNAP program and anticipates actually participating, that they can qualify under the SNAP exemption. They don't have to show actual work study pay stubs, and a number of states have embraced this policy to qualify students with work study. The second area that we see underutilized a lot is, and this is an unfortunate federal term, unfitness, but there's a federal exemption that says if you're physically or mentally unfit for work, and that means that you can't work on top of going to college. So you can't do the 20 hours a week as well as going to school full time. We have worked with Massachusetts to get to identify students who are placed into college post-secondary programs through the vocational rehabilitation programs. 18,000 college students a year are placed through voc rehab programs because they've identified an impairment or illness or incapacity that qualifies them for vocational rehabilitation. That is something that I think states should look closely at, as well as students who may come in with IEPs or, special needs and get through the college, they get accommodations, they get tutoring, extra time on exams and reports. Those can be ways that a state can characterize and qualify a student. Again, this is not our term, it's in the federal regs, unfit for work. The third area is something that we've done a lot of work on in Massachusetts with our community college system. The federal regulations authorize states to allow students to qualify as exempt if they are in state or locally administered programs for low-income persons. And our community college system disproportionately serves low-income persons. And the state agreed in 2010 that they would qualify as eligible for SNAP any community college students who, because they were either in a career or technical education program or because they were likely to become more employable with an associate's degree, would be eligible. And that's been our rule all along. It's very broad. Virtually all community college students qualify, assuming they meet the other income and immigrant citizenship status rules. It's something that I think states need to look closely at, and other states, as you'll learn from Oregon, have even gone broader on this. I want to clarify this is not part of the SNAP employment and training program where the states can claim reimbursement for the placement. This is simply an exemption so that students in community colleges can access food benefits. So I just want to make that distinction. And Ashley and I wrote the report in April of 2021 that is linked on that last slide. Finally, I wanted to look at what some additional options there are to improve SNAP enrollment. One of them is financial aid. Our state, Massachusetts, just implemented a policy to disregard all financial aid, not just the federally excluded, but all state, locally, and private financial aid a student receives. It just makes no sense for one body to determine that a student has financial needs to make their ends meet in college, and then another agency, the SNAP agency, counting that financial aid. It removes the need to verify the financial aid or to document which part is for tuition fees versus basic needs. That is a federal option available to states if they do it in their TANF program. There's no cost neutrality offset. They don't have to justify it by cutting somewhere else. They can simply change the TANF rules and bring that rule into the SNAP program or the Medicaid rules. Either way, they can bootstrap that policy. The second is eliminating unnecessary verifications. Under the SNAP rules, student status does not have to be verified. It is not a mandatory verification, unlike wages would be mandatory. And so if you approach the state with, do we really need to actually verify the status? Can we take a self-declaration, self-attestation from the student to verify their eligibility, unless something's questionable, to verify, any of those eligibility factors? That can significantly reduce not only the barriers for students, but the communication between students and trusted partners to help them apply for SNAP benefits. So I would look at those additional policies. They're state options that are available to every single state. And then finally, let's look at communication. And you'll hear more from Oregon and the great job they've been doing there. We think that the more direct communication from financial aid offices and departments of higher ed really helps to reach students. And this is going to be especially important as the public health emergency unwinds. There's some terrific materials available online. I'll show you a couple of samples from Massachusetts. Making applications more accessible to students. We have an online application, Massachusetts, that's terrific. You can upload your documents directly to your case, check the status of it. Make report changes, certain changes. We've implemented a simplified checkbox on our Medicaid Mass Health application to trigger a SNAP application. And we're looking hard and working with the state on making sure that the renewal or recertification forms that the state will be sending out as the public health emergency ends aggressively screen for all the other exemptions that they haven't been asking about during the public health emergency. In fact, there hasn't been interviews, so students haven't had an opportunity to raise their hand and say, oh, I have a disability or incapacity, or, I I received a work study, but I'm looking for work, but I haven't found a job yet. The other thing that I know, we have one campus in Massachusetts now that does this, the Holyoke Community College, but we have looked at this closely. When you get an EBT grocer on campus, it increases student participation. A number of states have done this. California has really excelled in this. And to the extent that you can convince your colleges to put an EBT grocer on campus, and to have prepared cold or flash frozen foods that can be heated up in the campus center. Students really gravitate towards SNAP when there's a connection between that food card and the food that's available on campus. Just want to share a letter that our state put out right after the federal public health emergency provisions were implemented, where the commissioner, Carlos Santiago of the Department of Public Health, not only had this letter sent to students, but talked about his own personal experiences getting SNAP. The receipt of this letter was sufficient to qualify students for SNAP, and they didn't need to provide any other verification. And this was sent to 94,000 students in Massachusetts right after Congress authorized the extended eligibility. And then finally, we did put together, this is a little bit out of date, we did put together a bunch of SNAP flyers that we used in social media and distributed to the colleges to talk about SNAP availability during COVID. Just so folks know, there's a 12.2% increase in SNAP effective October 1st, which means that the SNAP benefit for one person will be $281 a month. And if you're getting the maximum SNAP benefit, you would still get the extra $95 in the emergency allotment for as long as the public health emergency exists and your state implements the emergency allotments. So I just want to give you my contact information. This is a quote from one of the students that we collected stories of students with lived expertise. We have a hunger-free campus campaign right now in Massachusetts that's actually based on the success in New Jersey. And we're trying to pass legislation in our state to really hardwire into our higher ed system and fund hunger-free campus initiatives in the state. We did get 3.7 in ARPA funding dedicated last December to food security initiatives on campus. We want to get the law passed and see robust implementation of everything, including robust SNAP outreach and eligibility, EBT grocers on campus, a restaurant meal program if possible, and other initiatives to improve access to federal benefits for students. And with that, here's my contact information. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. That was great. And please put your questions in Q&A. We've already got a couple of very good questions that we'll address when our speakers are done. So if you have more questions, throw them into the Q&A. And so I'm now going to turn it over to Chris Baker, who's been doing terrific work in Oregon. And I will let her take it away.
Thank you so much, Tom. Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Baker. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the legislative strategist at Hunger Free Oregon. I'm both honored and grateful to be present with you all today. So thank you for having me. Next slide, please, Tom. Hunger Free Oregon is located in Portland, Oregon. We're a small team of 10 staff right now. Hunger Free Oregon works alongside those most impacted by hunger and poverty to advocate for systemic change. And together we create campaigns to win solutions. What's unique about our Hunger Free Campuses work is that it's led with those with direct lived experience and centered on student voices and experiences. All three of us on our Hunger Free Campuses team have lived experience of food insecurity. Two of us have experienced food insecurity as single parent college students, and I am one of those. Next slide, please. I'm going to share a little bit with you today about the work that we've been doing in Oregon to make SNAP accessible to college students. I'll touch on some of the state level efforts, along with the work that we've done at Hunger Free Oregon to increase SNAP access for college students. Next slide, please. So before I begin, I'll share briefly about the timeline of events that have brought us to where we are now in Oregon. So our college hunger work really began in late 2018 when students from the University of Oregon reached out to us asking for help in getting their administration to recognize the level of food insecurity among students on campus. At the time, my own son was a student there and experiencing food insecurity himself, and I was appalled to learn that there wasn't even a food pantry on campus to help support students. So Hunger Free Oregon is the administrative arm to the Oregon Hunger Task Force, which is a legislatively mandated body that consists of legislators, state administrators for state agencies, policy advocates, nonprofit organizations, and folks with lived experience. And we held a listening session on the campus of University of Oregon that included students, faculty, administration from the University of Oregon, and several other colleges and universities around the state, as well as legislators, state agency folks, and advocacy groups. This applied pressure on the administrators at University of Oregon and sparked many, many, many requests, not only from college students from the University of Oregon, but all across the state, for us to come and support them in their efforts to address college food insecurity and access to SNAP. So at Hunger Free Oregon, we began providing SNAP outreach trainings and built really deep relationships on campuses all across the state. We began to see the larger picture that students aren't just experiencing food insecurity, but overall basic needs and securities in general. And then in 2019, in response to what they'd learned at the listening session on the campus of the University of Oregon, policy analysts at Oregon's Department of Human Services took a deeper dive at the federal language around student SNAP eligibility and reinterpreted it in a way that has since provided access to several thousand college students. We then pivoted our SNAP outreach methodology at Hunger Free Oregon to include a train the trainer model that also included technical assistance training that any student leader, faculty member, or administrator could provide to students in need of support. So essentially, we trained students how to help support other students in applying for SNAP and how to do SNAP outreach on campus. And we provided everything that a college would need in our SNAP college toolkit, which I'll talk about a little more in depth shortly. And then in 2020, we worked on a piece of legislation that would provide a benefits navigator on every public college and university in Oregon. And that legislation passed in 2021. So at Hunger Free Oregon, we're currently providing SNAP education, outreach, and technical assistance training to the consortium of navigators across the state. And I believe Elizabeth Guzman Arroyo is presenting in another panel later today and doing a deeper dive on those benefit navigators. So be sure to check to see if you want to participate in that. Next slide, please, Tom. So I'll share briefly about Oregon's interpretation of federal SNAP eligibility for college students. So in Oregon, the 20-hour work requirement for students is waived if the student has indicated on their FAFSA that they're eligible and willing to participate in a work study program. So again, highlighting that the word anticipate working. So again, as Pat was sharing earlier, students do not have to share proof of a pay stub. We recognize in Oregon that there are many more students applying for a federal work study than there are jobs, and students aren't always able to get those jobs. Students are exempt from the 20-hour work week requirement if the student is enrolled in higher education under and for training and skills for employment listed under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. So the employment and training program or course of study must be of undergraduate, basically something under 4 years. And then the additional qualifier is if the student is residing in a dorm or other living situation with a meal plan that provides less than 50% of the student's meals, that makes them eligible for program benefits. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pivot now and share a little bit about the SNAP College Toolkit that I spoke of just a moment ago. Go ahead and next slide, Tom. Thank you. So eligibility, understanding student eligibility is critical for making sure that students can access the program. So we work with student leaders and staff to ensure that they can talk confidently about SNAP with students. We include an eligibility checklist that can help students better understand whether or not they are eligible. And we also offer an FAQ that acts as a great resource as well. Next slide, please. Going back to Oregon's interpretation of college student SNAP eligibility, we provide clear guidance for students on how to communicate that eligibility to DHS workers during their interview. As part of the eligibility criteria under the Workforce and Innovation and Opportunity Act, students need to let DHS workers know that they intend to have a job after completing their education. This means they'll have to be able to communicate the reason they're going to school. And so students should share a specific job they would like to do after they complete their education. So for example, if a student is studying for social work, they should indicate that they want to be a social worker, and that's how they claim that exemption. Next slide, please. So stigma. We absolutely know that stigma is a major reason why college students aren't accessing SNAP. We feel that it's very important that all messaging and actions on a college campus work to break down that stigma. So we provide a short overview of how to address stigma in SNAP messaging, how students can speak to one another. We offer some short scenarios for students and navigators to practice, to build confidence and to make it easier for conversations when students do stop by with questions. Next slide, please. We've met with so many amazing student advocates and are always impressed by the way schools customize their SNAP outreach efforts on their own campuses. So we keep a running list of best practices and strategies, and we share them widely. We know that SNAP outreach strategies work best when they're connected with existing food justice, STEP, and other basic needs programming already happening on campus. So we highly recommend designing a collaborative outreach plan that involves student, faculty, administration, leadership voices in its creation and implementation. That's so important, is bringing all of those together so that everyone is on the same page. And always, always, always a reminder to center the students who are disproportionately impacted by hunger in the planning and outreach. Next slide. We've developed outreach materials such as posters, flyers, bookmarks, buttons, etc., and we make them available for download for free on our website. We also offer social media plans and kits that can be adapted to each campus and their branding. Next slide. We stress the importance of creating a trusted space on campus where students can go to receive support and easily complete their application. Some schools have created regular DHS SNAP sign-up events where students can work with staff and student navigators to complete their SNAP application and then meet with a DHS caseworker, directly afterwards, right there on campus in a private space for their interview. And this has been incredibly, incredibly successful. Already for the beginning of this school year, we've had multiple requests from campuses to have these events on campus. We also offer an application assistance guide along with the PowerPoint and train the trainer model. We encourage navigators to become familiar with the application. We advocate for students by offering support before, during, and after the interview with DHS. And we offer connections to SNAP outreach contractors and contacts at schools across Oregon, for support. We also host a statewide listserv where student leaders, staff navigators can reach out for help and receive important information and updates. Next slide. So these are just some examples of the SNAP outreach buttons that we created during our Hunger Free Campuses campaign that are available on our website. Next slide. Speaking of our Hunger Free Campuses campaign, I mentioned earlier that Oregon passed HB 2835, our Benefits Navigator Bill, in 2021. This Benefit Navigator Bill provides a benefits navigator on every public college and university campus in Oregon. It creates a consortium of community colleges and universities to develop and/or continue to participate in ways for students to sign up for the benefits they qualify for, minimally SNAP and the SNAP Training and Employment Program, or STEP. And other benefit programs include housing assistance, the Oregon Health Plan, and support with EITC. Colleges and universities must include students in campus-wide planning on how to reduce food and housing insecurity. And each college with a benefits navigator receives DHS guidance. As I mentioned earlier, our SNAP outreach and technical assistance training now includes training and support for the statewide benefits navigator consortia. We're a little more than a year into implementation of the benefits navigators, and we're seeing a huge increase in benefits access among college students. There are current efforts in Oregon to expand on HB 2835, broadening the hunger-free campuses, more holistic approach to supporting students in this upcoming 2023 regular legislative session. And then finally on this slide, this is a list of resources that can be made available to you after the summit. And you can always reach out to me at Chris, CHRIS, at OregonHunger.org. And thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Chris. And thanks for all the great work you do. And we had a question about making the slide presentations available. I would like to say that we will do that. However, I'm not in charge of our resources. So I think it should be possible, but I will have to talk to the people who really are in charge of it to find out and get back to you. And Chris, the point that you made at the end about the value to students is an important one. And I think it is a difficult one for SNAP because nationally there is no field for tracking college students. So at a ground level, how do you know that getting students access to SNAP helps them and is meaningful to their well-being and to their student success? And at a data level, because higher education is so much about data, what should be the next steps? And I would open that to all of you to respond to.
I can share personally first. We know because our staff has personal lived experience. So I understand the value deeply of how SNAP benefited me. I wouldn't have been able to complete my degree without accessing SNAP benefits. And the way that we are trying to track student eligibility and SNAP access in Oregon is through our benefits navigators. And we're really hoping that with this consortia of benefits navigators, we'll be able to collect data that we haven't been able to collect from DHS in the past. And always, always, always bugging DHS to share their data with us.
Yeah, I will echo everything that Chris just said, and I will say that data collection would be a very important tool to have, both better understanding how food insecurity is impacting different populations of students in different states, but also to help us understand nationally what the trend is. So ideally, we would have that data to be able to help us better scope the policy and outreach efforts. But as states continue to do that, it will help us better understand what food insecurity looks like. I would hope one day to see that happen federally.
Yeah, thank you for that. And outreach is a critical piece of the puzzle, because I think we've seen that many college students, perhaps even the majority of college students, are unaware either that SNAP exists or that they can qualify for it, or that they should qualify for it. In that regard, it's noteworthy that the U.S. Department of Agriculture Food Nutrition Service requires states to submit an outreach plan and identifies who the priority groups are that states should focus on for the outreach plan. So one of those outreach groups is college students. And so how can those of us who are at institutions or who are students or an anti-hunger group, how would you know what states are doing and what they're not doing? Because if you're going to say that states should be taking action, they could take action through their human services agency, through an outreach partner. For example, Partners for Hunger-Free Oregon is an outreach partner, or in some other way. Sitting on the outside, how do you know what states are doing or not doing, and who would you talk to about making change and learning from the best practice models?
So we're not outreach partner, we're legal services. My hope is that the SNAP application process is so simple and straightforward that no one needs an outreach partner and that you can apply for your own benefits yourself, and to break down as many barriers to that. For example, as I said, now you can, through the Medicaid application, check a box that triggers a SNAP application. No hand-holding needed. Students also, I think, are one population that is likely to be most comfortable with online applications, as long as they're straightforward, not a lot of barriers in terms of verifications. There are some very effective outreach partners throughout the country. We have great partners in Massachusetts, Project Bread, Food Source Hotline, the food banks, and others. Being an outreach partner can be complicated based on the tracking of the administrative tasks involved. Those who do it well probably do a lot of volume. I think for small volume, I would recommend partnering with an existing outreach partner as opposed to trying to reinvent the wheel on the college. It's hard to just master all these programs. The reimbursement is only 50% roughly of the cost upfront of doing it. But there's so many ways that colleges can connect students to existing outreach partners, and more importantly, connect them directly to the online portals, and then work with legal services and other advocacy groups to break down those barriers that require someone else to intervene. Our goal is to not have to strap a lawyer to every person to access government benefits, to really break down those silos so it's seamless and readily accessible.
Thank you. So I think we have time for maybe one or two of the questions that were asked, maybe one. And so a person asked, what's the best strategy on approaching colleges with the intense bureaucracies that you have to navigate? And I think we could look at that from the perspective of the student. Like, if the student is going to ask for help from their college, where should they go? Because, you know, colleges are not always user-friendly to students. And nobody wants to take a stab at it. I'll make a suggestion, but I wanted to.
A lot of colleges do have basic needs staff. I mean, I think the work Oregon has done to have navigators is huge, whether they're outreach partners or not. So I think working with the college to recognize the basic needs of students, have staff, and really work directly with the financial aid offices. Students often go to the financial aid offices because they just don't have enough money. They need to figure out more grants. SNAP should be perceived as a financial aid resource as well.
And I agree with both the things Pat said. And if there is a food pantry on the campus or any other organization that's already addressing food insecurity, it also could be useful for the student to approach those organizations and partners to see if they can provide support as well in any efforts they already may be working on.
Right. That makes sense.